generational guilt, cultural identity, and killer elk ghosts. Is there anything else that you could want in a book? I just finished reading The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones, maybe about a week ago, and I've been letting the story ruminate in my head, just kind of thinking about how I feel, what the themes were, and just kind of letting the story cook in my head for a little while. Before I get into any spoiler type territory, I thought maybe I'd do a quick overview of the book and kind of my review, if you want to call it that. The Only Good Indians is a story about generational guilt, cultural identity, and revenge, essentially. It follows four Native American men who refer to themselves as Indians, knowing that the culture has kind of moved away from the term, but I think it is an important part of the story to know that there is a distinction and that they are, in fact, aware of it and mention it pretty often. The story follows these four Native American men who are members of the Blackfeet tribe, and they're haunted by a ghost of sorts from their past. The four of them had knowingly broken some laws or some rules or customs on the reservation that they had been living on at the time. The story picks up years after the four friends have gone their separate ways, but the 10-year anniversary of their transgression is approaching, and as the date gets closer, pieces and memories of that past slowly start to fall back into their lives. As the back of the book says, they're tracked by an entity bent on revenge. These childhood friends are helpless as the culture and traditions they left behind catch up to them in a violent and vengeful way. Overall, I really enjoyed this book and I really liked the story. There were some parts that I felt dragged a little bit more than others, and at times, motivations of some characters weren't exactly clear. There were also just sudden shifts in perspective that took me a while to get used to and just kind of accept that it was part of how the narrative was being told. The book isn't super scary, but it does have a really good atmosphere of creepiness, mystery, and suspense that I think really carry through the entire book. I really like the themes explored in the book, the themes of cultural identity and generational trauma. There is some violence towards animals, but some of it is also within the context of hunting. I'll leave that up to you whether it makes it better or worse. There isn't non-stop violence or spooky thrills throughout the story, but when there is something like that, it happens so suddenly and pretty brutally that I remember having to go back and like reread sentences to make sure what I had just read was actually correct because it just caught me so off guard. I did feel like the pacing in the last quarter of the book kind of slows down a little bit, and at the end of the story, there is a big showdown between the antagonist and another character. And you may or may not like how this showdown is presented. At first, I thought it was a little weird, but the longer I sat with it, the more I understand why it was there and what the motivations were behind everyone involved. I think if you're looking for something spooky to read that tackles issues like cultural identity and generational guilt, then I would definitely recommend giving The Only Good Indians a read. If I had to give it a number, I would give it a solid 7 out of 10. I really like the narrative flow and then the way that the themes were presented. And while the book is haunting, it wasn't especially scary. So if you're someone who wants to read a horror novel or dip your toes into the genre without getting too spooked, then I think this might be a good entry point for you. Alright, I'm gonna move into some spoiler territory and some spoiler discussions, so if you haven't read the book and you still want to, then I would recommend clicking off of the video. I'm gonna give it a few more seconds of buffer so people can have a chance to close the video in case they don't want anything to be spoiled. Okay, I think I'll just kind of tackle things as they appear in narrative order. I may skip over stuff, I may gloss over other things, because there's a lot going on in this book, and, I don't want to talk about every single detail, but the book opens up with a character named Ricky. It's made clear that Ricky is one of the four friends who participated in the transgression that they all did 10 years earlier, and he has left the reservation after his younger brother died of an overdose. If I remember correctly, at this point in the story, Ricky is just doing odd jobs and traveling from town to town where he can find work. He is at a local dive bar near one of his work sites, and he's obviously the outsider. He describes it as being full of rednecks and cowboys, and they're all staring him down for the most part. He decides to leave the bar or exit the bar because he has to pee and the line for the bathroom is way too long, so he's going to find somewhere outside in the parking lot to go to the bathroom. And when he's out amongst all the parked semi trucks and cars, he's greeted by a very large elk. As Ricky stares at the elk in disbelief, the elk starts to panic or it starts thrashing around and it starts crashing into cars and trucks and breaking mirrors and setting off alarms. And all of the cowboys and rednecks in the bar start to spill out because they hear a commotion. And before they can see that an elk is basically the one damaging all their trucks, it somehow disappears, and what they see is a bunch of broken vehicles with their alarms going off, and one Native American man standing right in the center of it. And so, what we get next is a pretty exciting chase scene. For a while, it really seems like Ricky is going to get away. He's dodging and weaving all of these guys chasing him down. But ultimately, the scene ends with them catching him, and then Ricky is essentially beaten to death in that dive bar parking lot. As the scene comes to an end, the last image we're left with is a large herd of elk just outside of the last reaches of light, watching Ricky get beaten to death. I think this scene does a really good job of setting up the overall themes that we're going to be seeing reoccur throughout the story. Ricky had just left the reservation, but thoughts of his home and the culture he left behind were just always in the back of his mind, which I really think speaks to the guilt of leaving behind your culture and the traditions that you had grown up learning. The way Ricky is on guard at all times when he's now in a world essentially surrounded by white people where he's the outsider, I think really speaks to the cultural identity and how it makes me think of how he essentially has a foot in each world but never really belonging to either one of them right now. Throughout the story, we see examples of characters trying to laugh off their Native American upbringing and heritage and make jokes about it while they're trying to lean into a more Western lifestyle. And there's always like a tinge of guilt when these things happen. And the herd of elk that set off the chain reaction that leads to Ricky's death, I think really symbolize the Native American past and culture manifested into guilt, and it's catching up to the rest of them. But I think this opening scene just does a wonderful job of setting up the story and setting the tone of what the rest of the book is going to be about. The next portion of the book is focused on a character named Lewis, and this section is the longest, but I also thought it was the most interesting, and I feel like it does the most to really shape our understanding of this world we're being dropped into. I believe Lewis was the first of the four friends to leave the reservation, and he did that because he ended up meeting and marrying a white woman named Peta. Lewis experiences a lot of guilt centered around leaving the reservation. He feels like he's left behind his culture, his heritage, his family, his friends. And even though Peta is very good for him, he loves her very much, he still can't shake the idea that he's abandoned his friends on the reservation to run off with some white girl. Lewis works at the local post office, and when we're introduced to him, we find out he's been charged with training a new postal worker named Shani, who is also a Native American woman who is part of the Crow tribe, I believe. Shani is young and flirty towards Lewis, and he feels uneasy and unsure of what to make of her. He starts to have thoughts of, oh, maybe the two Indians should be together and things like that. The way Shani makes him feel is important, and the reason is revealed later in the story. But the way Shani pushes her way into Lewis's life, I feel like is also representative of Lewis's past and Native American heritage, forcing its way back into his mind to make him reckon with the past that he's tried to abandon. Lewis begins to have visions of what he perceives as a creature that has the body of a woman but the head of an elk. These visions are starting to get the better of him, and he's slowly losing his grip on reality, what's real, what's not real, who's who, and why are they in his life. And it's made worse as the 10-year anniversary is starting to come up for what Lewis and his friends back on the reservation have dubbed the Thanksgiving Classic. The Thanksgiving Classic is really central to the main conflict of the story and really explains the motivations of our protagonist and also the antagonist. Lewis explains to his wife Peta that him and his friends, Ricky, Cass, and Gabe, were out hunting 10 years ago on the reservation, but they weren't having much luck. As they were starting to get more desperate, they started to wander on a portion of the reservation that was set aside for elders, and only certain people could hunt there at certain times of the year. But as they got there, they saw a very large herd of elk just out into the open. The four friends immediately begin to open fire on this very large herd of elk, and it's more of a massacre than it is actually hunting. One of the elk, and the one that Lewis knows for sure that he shot and killed, is actually pregnant, which is kind of weird for this time of year. Also, Native Americans have a long history of ensuring they use every part of the animal out of respect and out of living in community with nature. But at this point, a park ranger actually shows up and catches them hunting illegally on this part of the reservation, and he doesn't allow them to take any of the elk that they had just killed. The four friends essentially have to leave all of the elk there, creating somewhat of an elk graveyard. Lewis somehow manages to convince the park ranger to at least let him skin the one deer that he had shot, the pregnant one, and he takes that skin back with him. The Thanksgiving Classic represents what we could maybe call the ultimate taboo in terms of being a Native American person living on the reservation. Not only that, they are all essentially banned from hunting on that land for life, so that's a huge blow to the traditional views of being a hunter and a provider for your family. The guilt from this event has been weighing on Lewis for essentially a decade now, and it's all starting to catch up to him. Ultimately, Lewis comes to the conclusion that Shaney, his co-worker, is the ghost of the would-be mother elk that he had shot and killed that day on the Thanksgiving Classic. I think the elk is a physical manifestation of guilt that's out for revenge. Lewis and his friends disrupted the agreement between Native Americans and nature to live in community, and the elk ghost is there to remind them of that and remind them of what they had done and enact revenge. I don't want to get too much in the weeds about this, but some elk ghost shenanigans happen, some people die. Lewis tries to flee back to the reservation, but he ends up being gunned down in the process. The end of the story features both Gabe and Cass, who still live on the reservation. Cass has settled down with his girlfriend Jo, who he pretty much credits for turning his life around. He's become more productive, he's given up alcohol, and he just wants to create a better life for him and Jo. Gabe has kind of gone the opposite direction. He's essentially a deadbeat dad, although he does try to be involved in his daughter's life. His daughter is named Denora, and she actually becomes extremely important and the central figure for the ending segment of this story. The end of the book kind of meanders a little bit, in my opinion. We do get some nice backstory, though, on what everybody's been up to and how they've all been dealing with the guilt and the backfall from the Thanksgiving Classic. And we also get a good description and backstory of Denora, Gabe's daughter, and we find out that she's pretty much the best basketball player from the reservation or that this town has ever seen. She's pretty much guaranteed to make it out of this town, and basketball is going to be her vehicle to pay her way to doing so. I'm a little embarrassed to say I had to look this up because at this point I was confused as to why there's such a heavy basketball insert into this story. But apparently basketball is wildly popular on many reservations, and it can be considered as an expression of identity and pride for many Native American people. This made things make a lot more sense to me. While the four main characters have been struggling to find their identity in the world on and off the reservation, in the next generation, Denora, she had found a common thread in basketball as a way to bind her Native American heritage to the Western world. Cass and Gabe decide to hold an old-fashioned sweat lodge session to kind of cleanse themselves and give them a nice reset. And they were also paid by a local police officer who is also a Native American. He paid them to also include his son so his son could get a taste of the old heritage and some culture and maybe try to straighten him out a little bit. It's during this sweat lodge session that the elk attacks, and the elk actually kills all of them one at a time in some pretty brutal ways. Not only does she kill Cass and Gabe, she kills Cass's girlfriend and the cop as well. The elk doesn't just want them dead. The elk has been manipulating them to turn on each other and to confuse them. The elk wants revenge for her unborn calf in the worst way, so that doesn't mean just killing them, it means taking everything from their lives and destroying everything they have, which is essentially bad news for Denora because she is the child of one of the perpetrators of the Thanksgiving Classic. The next part of the story kind of had me on the fence for a while. Like I said, basketball is super important to many native cultures, and Denora has established herself and her identity solidly in the sport. But as part of the elk's revenge, she takes the form of Shaney, who was Lewis's co-worker. She takes the form of Shaney and challenges her to a game of one-on-one basketball. It's not just important to the elk that she take revenge by killing the perpetrators of the Thanksgiving Classic. She wants to destroy everything they hold important. It's crucial that the elk do this to Denora because why should Gabe be able to have a child when hers was taken from her illegally before her calf's life had even begun? After a lengthy but action-packed basketball sequence, Denora does eventually beat the elk in their game of one-on-one basketball. But the elk turns out to be a sore loser, so Denora has to flee, and she's running through the snow while being closely followed by the elk. Denora almost gives up several times because she's injured from the game, it's cold, she's freezing, and they're walking through essentially waist-high snow. But during this chase sequence, they do come across a long abandoned train cart, and this causes the elk to freeze. And I thought this was another interesting way to show generational trauma from the perspective of the elk, because the elk has a memory of a herd of elks generations ago basically being cornered by train cars and then they were all gunned down. So this fear has basically percolated through the generations of elk and they've learned to fear train cars. So this causes the elk to freeze up, much like deer freeze in the headlights of a car. Eventually, during the chase, Denora stumbles upon the site of the Thanksgiving Classic, which is now littered with the bodies and bones of dozens of elk that were shot and killed by the four protagonists a decade before these events. The elk is about to finish off Denora when she sees her dead body, and within the bones of her body, she sees the bones of her unborn calf. She takes the bones and picks them up and carries them into the wild. They resort to their animal form and they can finally rest in peace. I think this is some real sins of the father stuff. Denora is meant to pay the price for what her father has done, and she can't escape the generational guilt that's been passed down to her. Throughout the final sequence, she's running, but she also has to grapple with her heritage and how she's being raised off of the reservation by her stepfather, and she has to come to terms with what her father has done and ultimately close that loop. That's the basic overview of what I thought of The Only Good Indians. I know I brushed over a lot of things, glossed over a lot of other stuff, but I just wanted to use a wide brush stroke and just kind of get some ideas out there and some discussion going. Let me know if you've read this. Let me know what you've thought. Are my ideas and interpretations of the themes the same things you got out of the story, or did you get something else? Just let me know what your perspective is and whether you would recommend this for someone to read.